Okay, Tommaso, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. So I'm going to talk about the rise of market power. This is joint work with Jan de Loecker, Gabriel Unger, and I'm also going to talk about some other work trying to more formally understand the causes and the consequences. So it's only 15 minutes, it's going to be very limited, but I do want to give an idea of what we're working on. So let me start with giving a bit a summary of the facts that we find. So first of all, let me say we use a method that is what people call the cost-based method. It's only publicly traded firms, so there's a lot of caveats about what this purports to. The method is fairly simple. It's basically, rewriting the first-order condition of a firm's cost minimization decision. That involves estimating, on the one hand, an output elasticity, and then basically using accounting data. This gives us one markup for a firm. This is not about a good. This is not about a particular market. It's about a firm. Okay? And this, as a result, for all the firms that we have in the sample, gives us a distribution. And all I'm going to say today really pertains to the distribution of markups and how that has changed. I might tell you about average markups, and a lot of the debate in this literature now is about, magnitudes, and I'm going to try and explain a little bit what the different magnitudes, how they can be reconciled. But again, I want to stress, depending on how we weigh it and how we measure it, it's really all about a distribution. And then the last thing is that one thing is a markup, a margin, a price over marginal cost. But the other thing is market power. And market power is, in my view, a broader or it's a different definition. I don't want to say broader, but it takes into account really also fixed costs, which are not measured by margins. And I'm going to use profit rates to measure market power. And I want to link markups and market power. And I think, in my view, it's an important part of the debate. So here, let me start with the facts. This is the median in our sample going from 1955 to 2016. This is the median markup in this distribution. Okay? And as you can see, there's a little bit of movement, but it's fairly flat. Once we start to look at weighted average markups, we get this. So this is the sales-weighted markup, and we see that until 1980, you have a bit of an inverted U-shaped pattern, and then from 1980 onwards, you have a fairly steep decline. There's a bit of phases in there. So from 80 to 2000, you have a fairly steep decline. Then you have a flat period for the first decade of the 21st century. And then you have an increase again. What's underlying this, on the next graph, you're going to see the same thing, but now with a vertical axis that's being stretched, because I want to show you the P90. Okay, I want to show you the 90th percentile, which is here. The solid line, by the way, is still the same one that I had here. It's the same line just because I stretched out the vertical axis. The P90 is what driving really the increase in these markups. Okay, and you can also see this if I show you the kernel densities. So these are the densities for 2 years, 1980, the year where I kind of start to see the increase in these markups, and 2016, the last year. And so the dashed line is basically a density where we have about the same mode, the same mean as in 2016, but in 2016 we have this distribution with a fatter tail. Okay? This doesn't tell us everything about the markups, because I showed you the sales-weighted markup. This is just unweighted markups. This is a markup if I'm Amazon, I'm there, but if I'm with 2 million employees, or if I'm a biotech startup company with 100 employees, I'm also in there. Okay? So there's no weighting here, and a large part of the story is going to be about the weighting. In particular, even if the distribution had changed the same as in 1980, we could have seen an increase in the sales-weighted markups if sales moved from low markup firms to high markup firms. If we basically move the mass of sales from the left to the right of these distributions. And this is an important part of the story. So heterogeneity, yes, we see a rise in markups in some defined measure, but for most, there is no rise. In fact, the median for half of the firms, there's no rise, and there's a sharp rise for a few. I talked about this in front of Jim Bullard, who's the president of the St. Louis Fed, and he tells me, I go around my Federal Reserve district, and I talk to the business leaders, and they all tell me that business conditions are much worse than they were a few decades ago. Competition is harsher. And I asked him, did you actually meet the CEO of AB InBev, Anheuser-Busch, which is based in St. Louis? His name is Carlos Brito. This is one of the guys who's generated a lot of market power. They have high margins, high profits. And he said, no, because the reason is headquarters are actually in Belgium, because after all the mergers, they're no longer based in St. Louis, at least headquarters is not. Okay. And I think that's part of the story, that there are now a few firms that have enormous markups, market power, and most of the firms are actually not better off or even worse off. Okay. Second part of the story is, as I mentioned, this weighing. If I weigh by inputs instead of outputs, I get this dashed line, I get less of an increase in the markups. This is a point that's been made a while back by Basile Grassi and also more recently by Edmund Middelgen and Zhu. And it's important for the whole understanding of what's going on, because the reason why input weighting is lower than, or the increase in markups with input weighting is lower than with output weighting, is because there's a reallocation going on. Okay. Over time, we've seen that more and more sales is being done by high markup, high profit firms that basically become these superstar firms. So this is how we can decompose it here. I'm going to decompose the change in the markup in a markup that's due directly to the change in the markup, the distribution, the density I showed you, plus a term that's due to the fact that actually have kind of rebalancing of sales from low markup firm to high markup firms, which is going to be the black line if you can see the colors. And then there's a net entry term because we don't have we have entry and exit in this panel. Okay? And if I show you, what happens is the red line is basically our markups for the whole sample, cumulatively between 1980 and 2016, we see that the black line, which is this movement of sales from low markup firms to high markup firms, accounts for about 2/3 of the increase in the average markup. Okay? This is a point that's also been made by author and co-authors on superstar firms, because this tells us that there now must be many more large firms that are basically dominating these markets. Okay? That's the AB InBevs, that could be the Amazons. These are the firms that basically are not only getting high markups, they're also having high market shares. So reallocation of sales from low to high markup firms is crucial, and it accounts for 2/3 of the rise in average markups. The third point is that technology changes. So what I show here is basically the share of overheads in total cost, and that's since 1980 going from about 15% to around 21, 22% later on. And there is a technological change going on. We don't see that much of a change in the returns to scale. I can come back to what I mean by that, but we see this driving most of the technological change. And I believe this is consistent with the story that John Sutton has been proposing for a long time, the idea that with higher upfront investments, I can get lower marginal cost. And a way for firms to compete and getting market power is to basically generate this market power endogenously through investment. Okay. This is consistent. We have much more detailed analysis that shows that the firms that have the highest markups are the ones that have actually the highest at the firm level. These are just averages, right? At the firm level, the ones with the highest markups are these firms that have the highest fixed costs. So this is consistent with John Sutton's story. And then the last thing I want to say is a point about the proper aggregation. Bob Hall, our method of this cost-based estimation of markups is based on a paper by Bob Hall from 1988, where he uses the same type of first-order condition, but at the industry level. And he has used Clem's data, so aggregate data, to measure a markup at the economy-wide level. And what Bob finds is, he says, I redo your analysis with my 1988 kind of data and approach to the sector-level markup, and I get an increase of the markup about half of what you get. Okay, you get 40 points from 1.2 to 1.6. I get about 20 points. So what we do is we take our data, we disaggregated the firm-level data, and we say, let's assume that we only observe now sectoral-level data. Okay? And let's do exactly Bob's analysis. And what we find is we do it in 3 different ways. Okay, we can talk about what the differences are. But you get exactly what Bob gets in the aggregate. Okay? So what it says is, in the 3 bottom lines, we don't have a market per firm, we have a market per industry. But remember, this is based on exactly the same data as the firm-level data, which is the red line. So what it says is that once you pool at the industry level, you lose a lot of heterogeneity that is important in the aggregation. And this is nothing more than a standard case of Jensen's inequality. It's not just linear aggregation. Right? And moreover, the gap between the 2 lines is increasing because that distribution has become more and more spread out. If firms are identical, this aggregation issue would not be there. It is because of the heterogeneity. Okay? And so what we see is that, yes, when you aggregate, you get much lower increases in markups, but you're completely losing part of the picture or of the story. You're losing the fact that there's a lot of increase in markups, in the distribution of markups within industry. Okay? And that's what this is telling us. And then another kind of related issue in measurement is that people say, well, how can you get a 40-point increase in markup, in margins, and at the same time we see that profits as a share of sales is not that high. Okay? In particular now, towards our measures of profits for these publicly traded firms, we get around 7 to 8%. We see this is the profit rate. Okay? There's this issue, I kind of invite you to ignore. It has to do with our measurement of capital, and this is high inflation period. If we exclude measures of capital and we look at operating profits, this completely disappears. But what we see is that basically profits go from around 1% of sales to around 7 to 8% of sales. How is this reconciled with the fact that we have an increase of 40 points in the markups? Well, there is an identity. The identity is the following. If I look at the profit rate, okay, which is just sales minus total cost over sales, that can be written as 1 minus what? Well, cost over quantity is average cost, and I can write price as markup times marginal cost, because markup is price over marginal cost. So this is an identity, virtually no assumptions needed. This is true at every firm level. Okay? So now, what can we do now? Let's plug in our 2016 markup of 1.6, 1.61 it is in fact, okay? And let's assume that this is 1, I'll come back to that. What we get is we get a profit rate of 38%, okay? This is 38% of sales. If you would look at it as a measure of value added, equivalent of GDP, you would get close to 80%. Who believes that profits today are 80% of GDP? I don't. Okay. But I also don't believe that you should plug in averages here. This has eyes in here. This is at the firm level. Why is this going so wrong? This is going wrong for 2 reasons. The first reason is, again, the same Jensen's inequality, aggregation. You cannot just simply aggregate, okay, assuming that this aggregation is linear. If you properly aggregate and you say, yeah, let me plug in the individual level firm level markup and then integrate with the appropriate weight, rather than just plugging in the average, you already get a decrease of half of this. The second thing that has changed is technology has changed. I showed you that the fixed cost as a share of the total cost has gone up between 1980 and 2016. So as a result, average cost over marginal cost is going to have gone up. Okay? And so these 2 reasons, okay, the fact that you do proper aggregation and you account for the change in technology, i.e. that the ratio average cost over marginal cost has increased substantially, okay, is going to tell us that this is just a bogus number. And in fact, if you look at it, my 0.38, the blue line is if I just use aggregates and I don't account for changes in technology. The red line is what happened, what the profit rate is if I properly do that. And that's much closer to the empirically observed profit rate. So just to summarize, these are the kind of the facts that we find. There's a lot of heterogeneity. It's all about the change in distribution. I really invite you not to focus on some average, but really on the change in the distribution. Reallocation is crucial. The fact that sales is moving from low markup firms to high markup firms. Technology matters substantially. There's a change in the fixed cost. And the magnitude, different numbers are being thrown around. They are consistent with each other. You just have to be careful to not interpret the markup as the same thing as, a profit rate. This is only publicly traded firms, so this is around 40% of GDP. Let me show you what we do in the senses of manufacturing. This is all firms, the universe of firms, but of course a very narrow subset of the industries being manufacturing. We see similar patterns in terms of the rise and in terms of the distributional changes. And then also globally, we have a data set again of publicly traded firms, again, with restrictions and with caution in interpreting these results. But we see a similar pattern in the set of globally publicly traded firms, okay? And a rise from 1980 to 2000, then a part in which there's kind of not much of a change in the average market, but then again, an increase. This is true for different parts of the world. And even in Germany, you might think Germany is maybe a more competitive industry sector. I mean, the levels are somewhat lower, but the rise over this period is very similar. Okay, let me use the last minute and a half that I have to talk about the causes and consequences. In different work, what we're trying to understand is, as Tommaso said, I come more from the macro side. We try to think of, how can this have implications at the macro level once we think of this in a general equilibrium context. And to understand it, we also have to know why there is a change in the distribution of markups. So what we do, let me just tell you briefly what we do, is we say, okay, let's look at two reasons for which there's a change in the markup. One is, purely changes in the markup, in the market structure. So we model basically a large number of sectors that are imperfectly competitive. And these are sectors with free entry. We have a Berry 92 style entry process. What happens in there is if you change the number of potential entrants, the degree of competition exposed changes. Now this has for an effect that, of course, if fewer firms compete, there's going to be higher deadweight loss. But there's a second thing that's happening. There's a selection of the type of firms that enters. And we can measure the cost of selection there. In fact, selection there as deadweight loss has a negative effect. The second reason why you can see a change in markups has to do with the fact that if technology changes, okay, you're going to have different firms, different types of firms, again, a selection of firms entering, and this is going to have, again, an effect on deadweight loss. What we see there is that if the fixed cost goes up, you actually have a positive selection effect. Why? Because, the standards for entering are higher, so only the better firms can enter. I call this the Amazon paradox because, the good thing about Amazon is that they bring this to you at a very low cost. We love that. But at the same time, they're so much more productive than other firms that they drive out competitors. So this getting cheap because they're productive is great, but this not being priced competitively because there's no competition is not so great for the customer. And these two forces counterbalance. And what we see is that, there's a positive selection effect going on, but it's actually outweighed by this negative effect that we estimate in this model due to the loss of consumer surplus. The second reason why technology has an effect on markups is the change in the distribution of productivity, and this is again related to Amazon. Take a Kernel model with two identical firms. Both firms have the same markups, same profits, same market share. Now let's do a mean preserving spread. There's going to be one firm that has high markups, high market share, high profits, and one firm that has everything low. Okay. Now in the limit, even though there's two firms, there's going to be one firm that's basically going to have a zero market share. That basically means that we have a monopoly, right? We have a monopoly with two firms where one firm has zero market share and one firm has the entire market. Now what we show is that if you have a mean preserving spread in productivities, this gives rise to increases in markups. And you can think that this is again a story of Amazon. Okay, Amazon, maybe through upfront investment, has become so productive that it's become kind of close to a monopolist in the retail market. And we show again that this has a positive effect. This has a positive selection effect, but there's at the same time the negative effect of lower competition, i.e. increased deadweight loss. Okay? And so what we see is when we estimate, we see both changes in the market structure and we see both changes in the technology. The net effect is negative. Okay? The net effect is that there's welfare loss, and about half of it is due to selection, half of the negative effect is due to the loss of deadweight loss. And the last thing I want to say is, okay, once you admit or you kind of agree with the fact that there's a change in markups economy-wide, okay, now you can start to think about changes that are going to be the consequence of that economy-wide. And in particular, we focus on what the consequences are of this change in the distribution of markups in standard macro variables. So what are they? Well, the one thing we find automatically is that, we get wage stagnation. In particular, the share of wages is going down. Why is that? Well, this is a pure equilibrium effect. This has nothing to do with monopsony that, Amazon comes to town and it exploits the workers and pays lower wages. It's got to do with the fact that economy-wide, because prices are higher, the demand is going to be lower, therefore the demand for inputs is going to be lower. Therefore, the demand for labor is going to lower wages. That's a pure general equilibrium effect, nothing to do with monopsony power. The second point is that we see a decline in the labor share in the aggregate, but what happens in this world is that, the demand for inputs at the firm level is going to be lower, so the share of inputs of sales is going to be lower at the firm level. Now, if you have enough firms that have high enough markups, then these firms, once we aggregate, are going to lead to there being a labor share in the aggregate that's going to be lower. So what we're saying is that at the firm level, all those firms individually that have higher markups, we're going to see firms that are going to have a lower labor share, and that's very strongly in the data. Okay, we see that it's the firms with the highest markups that have the lower labor shares. And not surprisingly, once you aggregate this, you get an aggregate decline in the labor share that macroeconomists have been really at trouble trying to explain, with changes in technology or population or demographic changes. And what we're saying is that you can explain this aggregate phenomenon by looking at the firm level markups. The third kind of secular trend, as people call those in macro, is this decline in business dynamism. This is John Haltewanger's kind of a central theme for the last 15 years. And he says, we see that the change in the rate at which firms adjust their labor force is declining over time. In fact, it's declined by about 45 to 50%. Okay, it's going from 0.35 to 0.24. Okay. And so what does that say? It says that firms adjust their labor force less frequently to a lesser extent. What we show is that if you have market power, okay, you have less pass-through. We typically think of pass-through as the effect on prices. I have a change in my marginal cost. What kind of an effect does it have at the price, on the price at which I'm selling my good? That's fine, that's there, but if you have less of pass-through in terms of the price, look at your demand curve, you also pass less through in terms of the quantity. You have certain shocks to productivity, prices change less if you have market power, but also quantities, because you're moving along a demand curve. And so, because of the increase in market power of some of these firms and the distribution of these firms, what we see is that these firms have less of pass-through in terms of the quantities. Therefore, they're going to adjust their inputs to a lesser extent. Okay. And then the fourth consequence is this, Author et al. Observation that we get these large superstar firms really in a model like that, once market power increases, whether it's for technological reasons or for the change in the market structure, what you see is that market share is moving from low market firms to high market firms. And we create, fewer or a lot of small firms and a few enormously large superstar firms. The one conclusion I want to I hope I can convince you of is that whether or not you believe these facts, once you start to think about the consequences and about the implications of market power, it's virtually impossible to do this in the context of a representative firm. It's all about the change in what happens in the distribution and what, we have to think really about heterogeneous firm models to understand what's going on here. Because a representative firm does really not help us catch any of these consequences, and it doesn't coincide with any of these facts that we find. Because a representative firm ignores aggregations, get different magnitudes, doesn't have reallocation. Okay, so I just want to drive down the point that we really have to think about heterogeneous firms to do that. Thank you.
We don't take questions unless very urgent clarification questions are around, and we move to Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you, Tommaso, and all of my hosts. Delighted to have been invited and to see all of you. My presentation today will attempt to create a bridge between what Jan just talked about and what Fiona has to say. I'm going to start by talking about several economic reasons to think that market power has been increasing for decades in the United States beyond what Jan discussed. And then I'll talk about some causes, and which is, we'll get into the antitrust issues that Tommaso previewed. And I'll conclude by sketching a few reasons for concern about exclusionary conduct by dominant platforms, which is something I expect Fiona will have much more to say about. Most of what I'm going to speak about is US focused. I have the impression, and Jan seems to have confirmed it, that there are similar but weaker trends in Europe, but I haven't surveyed those studies systematically. So the US brewing industry illustrates the problem. We have two firms, the owners of Budweiser and Miller, that sell 3/4 of the beer in the United States. And they each have a large number of brands. There are a very large number of craft brewers, but they're small and costly and can't easily expand, and they don't constrain the exercise of market power by the two large firms. Concentration in the brewing industry in the United States is not the problem per se, but it's related to market power. There's a good recent study using a modern economic toolkit that shows that coordination leads to higher prices, as well as to the unilateral effects of merger. And this seems to be going on in other sectors of the American economy as well. In part because antitrust has failed. In the brewing industry case, too many mergers were allowed. So let me start with the accumulating evidence that market power is on the rise. As was evident in Jan's slides, market power has been growing for decades. But it turns out that the reasons to think that only became evident in economic research during the past 5 or so years. And we've just heard a long presentation about one of those reasons, the increasing price-cost margins over several decades. Jan didn't quite say this in his talk, but it's likely that it's related to the use of information technology, both the growth of dominant information technology platforms, but also information technology investments by firms in the rest of the economy. I want to highlight 3 other reasons to think that market power is on the rise. The first is that there's growing market power in a number of oligopolies. That's something we've learned based on industry studies like the brewing example that I mentioned before. And it's often the same industries where concentration is increasing through merger. So some other US examples include hospitals and airlines, for example. I'm not talking about aggregate concentration. That's poorly measured, it's hard to interpret. But I'm talking about market power in specific industry, concentration and market power in specific industries. And the concern about the market power of oligopolies in the United States is not limited to product markets. There's also a concern about the exercise of market power in depressing wages on the other side of the market. The second reason to think market power is on the rise beyond what Jan spoke about is the likelihood that we have less competition in the American economy than we did decades ago, because product market rivals increasingly have common financial owners. So that's a growing concern, because large, diversified financial investors, I'm talking about BlackRock and Fidelity and Vanguard, firms like that, accounted for 1/3 of equity holdings in 1980 in the United States, and now it's up to 2/3 of equity holdings. The third reason to think market power is on the rise is that greater market power is a leading suspect in the decline of economic dynamism in the US. We have seen a secular slowdown in business investment, a lower labor share of gross domestic product, a reduced rate of startups, a lessened rate of expansion when firms grow more productive. And increasing market power could explain, or at least help explain, these macroeconomic features, and for some of those features, it's the leading candidate. Now, all the studies in the different areas that I've alluded to have weaknesses, but the weaknesses are all different. They're uncorrelated. So this is an example where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And taken as a whole, the evidence can't be explained without supposing growing market power. Now, there's a benign explanation for some of what we've seen. involving growing scale economies, which is, and temporary rents to first movers with information technology and competitive markets. If all we knew was that margins had gone up and concentration had increased in many industries, and that the labor share of gross domestic product had fallen, we probably couldn't reject the benign alternative, that this is just competition with growing scale economies and temporary rents to first movers to information technology. And that, in fact, could be part of the reason why we see what we're observing in the US economy today. But the benign alternative isn't the full story. Growing market power has to be important too. The same fixed costs that create scale economies can deter entry and soften competition. And the benign story can't explain why we see growing market power in many oligopolies based on evidence other than concentration. And it can't explain various features of reduced dynamism like the slowed investment rate, the startup rate, or the rate at which more productive firms expand. And it can't explain the increase in common financial owners of product market rivals. All right, so with that introduction to growing market power, let me turn to causes. And in particular, I want to argue that growing market power in the United States can plausibly be attributed, at least in substantial part, to relaxed antitrust enforcement. Now, there's little question that antitrust constraints have been relaxed in the United States. The courts, beginning in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the courts modified many U.S. antitrust rules. They made it easier for defendants to prevail in cases involving non-price vertical restraints, resale price maintenance, exclusive dealing, predatory pricing, and horizontal mergers. And the rules were relaxed the most for exclusionary conduct offenses. So today, plaintiffs rarely succeed when they attack vertical restraints, allege predatory pricing, or challenging a dominant firm's unilateral refusal to deal unless there was a prior voluntary course of dealing. Market power likely started to grow in the United States after that, and the timing is consistent with the margin slides that Jan just showed you. The antitrust rules didn't change the same way in the rest of the world, but then the market power problem might not be as great in the rest of the world as in the United States. Now, there are several reasons, economic reasons, to think that US antitrust law insufficiently deters harmful conduct today. And those reasons tie the relaxation of antitrust rules to the market power problem. So the first is it's likely that we insufficiently deter anti-competitive coordinated conduct. So the best estimates in the economics literature are that enforcers catch only something like 15% of cartels. And when you think about that, it suggests that there's a huge market power iceberg because it's likely easier to deter express price fixing and market division than more tacit forms of coordination. So if we're only catching 15% of cartels, think about what's going on with other forms of coordination. And although I'm talking about the US mostly, that's likely true in Europe too. Second, there's evidence that we insufficiently deter anti-competitive horizontal mergers. There are retrospective analyses of horizontal merger cases close to the line but allowed to proceed that tend to show this. And we also have evidence involving, I guess I could tell you what the papers are if you want to know later. A systematic look at margins and productivity following horizontal acquisitions involving manufacturing plants. There's work on killer acquisitions. There's evidence that more horizontal mergers that are just below the size where they have to be notified than just above. And that too tends to suggest we're insufficiently deterring anti-competitive horizontal mergers. And then finally, there's evidence that we're insufficiently deterring anti-competitive exclusion although that evidence is more directed towards vertical conduct generally, which is not the same as exclusionary conduct, but correlated with it. So there's evidence of harm from various vertical mergers and from resale price maintenance, and evidence that vertical restraints tend to support cartels. Another reason to think that the US insufficiently deters harmful conduct, anti-competitive conduct, is the extent to which our courts and commentators accept erroneous economic arguments that support under-enforcement. So just for example, contrary to what Judge Frank Easterbrook has famously argued, markets don't self-correct. So the average cartel cut short by antitrust enforcement lasted 8 years, and some last 40 or more years. There are many examples of durable single-firm market power during the 20th century. Firms like Kodak and General Motors and US Steel and Xerox and Alcoa had their market power last a long time. In many cases, it eventually eroded or they were replaced, but the market power was durable while it lasted for a long time. And so another erroneous economic argument, contrary to what some people suggest, including courts, some courts, monopolists can usually obtain more than a single monopoly profit. And contrary to what is sometimes suggested, business practices that are prevalent in competitive markets can harm competition. So now let me say something about the importance of today's market power problem. We're used to thinking about the harms from market power in the affected markets. So as sellers exercise market power, they transfer rents from buyers, and then there's this allocative efficiency loss. And there can also be wasteful rent-seeking, when sellers spend, for example, sellers may spend resources to erect entry barriers or to lobby for them. The economy-wide effects of market power could be even more important. These effects can work through incentives or through selection. And they include slowed economic growth. And we have, there are cross-national and cross-industry studies suggesting that differences in competition and product markets across nations are likely as important in explaining growth as cross-national differences in macroeconomic policies. There are studies showing the economy-wide impacts also include less productivity growth, a lessened innovation rate, and a greater inequality. And the reason that we see that is that the producer's surplus from the exercise of market power accrues primarily to shareholders and top executives who are wealthier on average than the median consumer. In the United States, about the top 10% hold 80% of stock and mutual fund assets, even after accounting for indirect ownership through retirement plans, and the top 1% hold half of those financial assets. The rents from market power don't go to workers in the US with the decline of private sector unionization, and the exercise of monopsony power in labor markets could further contribute to inequality. So we have in the United States, and most likely to a lesser extent in the rest of the world, a growing and serious market power problem. In the US, it's attributable in part to a relaxation of antitrust rules decades ago. And I also suggested above that, previously, that this is the increased market power problem is tied empirically to the growth of information technology. So, okay, in the last 5 minutes or so, I guess, I want to move away from the big picture and discuss some more narrow reasons for concern about market power in the digital economy. And more specifically, exclusionary conduct by dominant online platforms, that's a particular problem when strong network effects push towards a winner-take-most market, as with some prominent platforms. In that setting, the possibility of competition comes mainly from business stealing or disruption by small and potential rivals, so conduct excluding them is a particular concern. And I'm using the term exclusion broadly. It's not just preventing competition altogether, but various kinds of disadvantaging rivals too. Information technology platforms can harm competition by excluding rivals in a number of ways, and many of these ways are familiar. Exclusivity through vertical merger, exclusive dealing, predatory pricing, platform most favored nations clauses, for example. And others are newly enabled by big data. With the digital economy in mind, I want to say something about exclusion using big data. And if time permits, I'll say something also about conduct that increases customer switching costs and something about the exclusion of potential competitors and the innovation consequences of that. So when we talk about big data on the customer side, the antitrust conversation often involves three topics. Privacy as a non-price dimension of competition is one of them, although the more important privacy conversation involves consumer protection, not antitrust. Another topic that comes up is involving big data, customer data, is perfect price discrimination. And a third is access to data as an entry barrier, which I think of as an instance of a broader possibility of exclusion through the denial of scale economies. So, and I want to focus in my remaining minutes on a fourth possibility, which is probably hypothetical today, but a threat for the future, targeted discounts. And I'll give you a hypothetical example involving Amazon's shopping platform. And the example is purely hypothetical, and I'm not trying to pick on Amazon specifically by using it as an illustration. So now suppose that Amazon can identify occasional Amazon shoppers who are the best online customers of its platform rivals. So in the US, that might be Best Buy or Macy's or Staples or Walmart, and I don't know quite what the European equivalents are. And suppose that Amazon can target those shoppers with low prices. And finally, suppose that the availability of customer data is asymmetric. So the rival platforms don't know nearly as much about household preferences as Amazon knows. So Amazon can target its rivals' best customers, but the other platforms, the rival platforms, can't practically target Amazon's platforms in return. Now, so we can have selective and targeted price cuts to potential customers. Now, that might seem like a pure benefit to competition, and in some cases it no doubt would be. Some customers are getting discount offers. But in practice, that could also harm competition, or instead harm competition, when it's employed by a dominant platform to exclude. If Amazon can take away from its rivals a substantial group of their most frequent customers, it may be able to raise its rivals' marginal cost of attracting additional sales. And the rival platforms could be led to raise prices in order to avoid losses, or they may choose to compete less aggressively with Amazon to induce it to back off. You know, in something like the way the story works in, what's it called? I'm drawing a blank. The supermarkets with multiple, chain store paradox, thank you. Chain store paradox, that's what I'm thinking of, yeah. Something like the way it works with the chain store paradox. You'll excuse my senior moment. Either way, whether Amazon is, whether the rivals are raising prices to avoid losses when their marginal costs of attracting customers have gone up, or whether they're induced to back off by the threat of competition, Amazon may be able to obtain, maintain, or enhance market power in online shopping. And all online shoppers may end up paying more, regardless of what shopping platforms they use. And Amazon may not even need to implement targeted price cuts to induce its rivals to back off competitively, or at least not often, because once Amazon has the power to target selectively the customers of a rival platform that doesn't have a comparability to target Amazon's customers, and its rivals recognize that ability, the threat of selective discounting may be enough to induce the rival to avoid provoking Amazon by undercutting its prices in the first place. And even if threats alone aren't enough, selective customer targeting may be an inexpensive exclusionary strategy, because The dominant firm doesn't have to reduce price to its existing customers, and only to the customers likely to purchase from its rivals. And I could have told the same kind of story about competition on the platform, with Amazon using selective discounting to benefit one of its private label products, in competition with rival branded products, too. But I think, looking at my time, I think I should wrap up now and say that my hypothetical examples is intended to suggest just possible ways by which dominant online platforms can exercise market power. But I'll just say one sentence in concluding, widening the lens, and reminding you that I began with brewing, which shows that growing market power is a problem generally and not just in digital markets. So thank you.
So thank you very much. So again, a lot of meat. So think about what you would like to ask Jonathan then in a few minutes.
Do you want me to use this or this?
I have to ask the.
Do you want me to use the I guess I have an answer. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and thanks to Tommaso for a very generous introduction. I wanted to just say one remark about the Crusader reference before that gets too popular. So for me, this is a new level of attention, and I'm glad because it shows public interest. But it's not really, you should understand that, why is it that there is public interest? Because I think there is some sense by the population that markets are not working well for them. Why is it that economists like Jonathan, me, Jan, others are speaking out? It's to explain that economics is a tool, and to use this tool rigorously to show that anti-competitive conduct causes harm. In the United States, starting in the 1970s, economics was a tool to explain why you didn't need to enforce the antitrust laws. Okay? This is not what a tool does. A tool does not presuppose its conclusion. A tool can be used with theory and evidence to get the right answer. Okay? And we have much theory and evidence in the United States today demonstrating that we have been under-enforcing. So you can show that under-enforcement causes harm to consumers, then that harm to consumers may be part of what's going on with our rising income inequality and populism and so on. So I think these consumers need help, and one way to help them is to use the tools that we have correctly, with the evidence that we have correctly. It's a little boring. I mean, what we do is just economics with models you already have, empirical methods we already have, laws we already have. And what's interesting to me is applying all that boring stuff and coming out with the answer that we need some antitrust enforcement gets labeled by the media as something new and different. And that's troubling in and of itself, right? So that's not really what my slides are about. So let's turn to the topic that I'm supposed to be talking about, which is competition enforcement in digital platforms. What makes these platforms quite difficult to enforce against is that they have a number of characteristics simultaneously. Economies of scale, because of low or zero marginal cost. Economies of scope, because the installed base can be used. I can take my Uber car and make it into an Uber bicycle. Increasing returns to data, already mentioned, and then network externalities. This is when everybody wants to be on the same platform because they benefit from the other consumers on the platform. This would be true of a social media site, your telephone. Your telephone is useful because you can phone other people. If you were the only person on your telephone network, you wouldn't really want that telephone because who would you call, right? So markets with network externalities are prone to tipping. Everybody wants to be on one platform and you get a monopoly. And often these settings are two-sided. That means I've got one group of, I've got some sellers and I've got some buyers, and both want to be on the platform where everybody else is, and you get a firm like eBay where again, this tipping occurs. So we have large firms, we have concentrated market structures, and where is the competition? The competition is for the market, not in the market. Once all of this is shaken out, you have a dominant firm, and it's a bit too late. One of the things that has become apparent in the last few years is that consumer behavior really shapes this market structure. The biases demonstrated by 30 years of behavioral economics, things like status quo bias, default bias, impatience by consumers, hyperbolic discounting. What does that mean? Consumers don't scroll to the second page to look at more results. They allow whatever the default installation of an app is, they leave it there. They do not multi-home. They go to one place to search or to find a car or whatever. They don't change default settings. What does that mean? That means it's much harder for an entrant. The entrant can't be slightly less good and get your attention. You use the default, you let the dominant firm frame your search, and you follow their framing. You let the dominant firm, set up defaults, and you follow them. So that helps concentration to persist. So entry here, the sort of bottom line is that entry is super valuable, and any kind of entry is super valuable, whether the entrant is vertical, horizontal, successful, nascent, potential, another large platform in an adjacent space. These are all very valuable forms of entry, and those kinds of entrants provide choice, different quality, or the threat of choice and different quality that is going to make the incumbent run faster. So entry raises consumer welfare, lowers prices, raises quality, creates innovation. Okay, an aside on free. Free is not a special zone where economics and antitrust do not apply. Okay, free means the money price is zero. Think of a number line, okay? The number line is where the firm gets to choose a price, and they happen to have picked a price where the symbol is zero, okay? But the symbol could have been -2 or +2. And other monetary conditions may be attached to this trade. So if, imagine a competitive price were negative. So my data is so valuable that when I go to the platform, not only do I get a service, but they would be willing to pay me $2 just to get my data. $2 plus the services in order to get my data. And it could be that insufficient competition means that the platform marks up that -€2, I should say, excuse me, €2 to 0. So instead of being paid €2, I'm going to be paid 0 for my data. Okay, plus I get the services. So today, digital services are bartered by platforms. They've chosen a monetary price of 0, but in principle, both the data and the services have monetary prices. And it's completely not obvious that the equilibrium competitive price is 0. Okay, in fact, it's a little suspicious that every single platform, the market transaction has worked out to be exactly 0, right? That seems unlikely. So what are the harms that we get from market power and platforms? We have price harms. Advertisers may pay markups for online ads. Consumers may pay markups for services. We have potential quality harms. Digital businesses are going to learn by using high-dimensional, large data sets to explore every nook and cranny of your behavioral biases, get you to watch things you wouldn't otherwise watch, consume things you wouldn't otherwise consume, and offer targeted sales, for example, reading email, understanding the teenager is depressed, and giving her ads for makeup, okay, which you can then get her to buy because of her emotional state. So framing, nudges, and defaults can direct a consumer to a profitable choice for the platform, but something that really represents low-quality content for the consumer. And then the third harm is harm to innovation. Insufficient competition and entry results in harm to investment and innovation. And we have a lot of economic research telling us this basic principle, that when there's anti-competitive conduct and as a result the company does not face enough competition, then it does not work as hard to innovate. And this lessening or blocking of innovation is of particular concern to society because of its huge value to consumers. When you look at Jan can tell us later about the macro literature on productivity, it's really coming from innovation, not from reallocation of resources or lower prices. And we've learned from past big antitrust cases in the United States, IBM and Microsoft, that really the big harm was the direction of innovation. When those cases occurred, it was a real inflection point, and innovation looked quite different after those cases than it did before. Okay, so I've talked about entry and said that it's really important. And because entry is difficult due to barriers like network effects, myopic and inertial consumers, and then, of course, anti-competitive conduct like exclusive contracts or bundling, And then a big one that has caused a lot of attention today is the acquisition of small entrants. We're going to prevent entry by just buying up the entrant. And that entrant represents important nascent or potential competition. These factors that reduce entry are real places where policy could make a difference. Okay? One of the most helpful policies a government can adopt is to find a way to protect entrants. And the last two might involve competition enforcement. The first two, I will argue, involve probably some regulation. Let me turn to entrepreneurs and innovation. You often hear that the venture capitalist needs this ability to be purchased by the platform in order to invent and invest and start a business. That's how they're going to get their payoff, is being bought out. A venture capitalist has little incentive to invest in an innovative startup that's going to directly compete with a dominant platform, because one of two things are likely to happen. They'll be excluded by the platform, or they'll be bought by the platform. And now being bought might be good. It depends on the price at which you're bought. So let's assume the first one, exclusion, doesn't get you a payoff, but being bought does get you a payoff. Now, the second one, being bought, does incentivize a funny kind of innovation, which is, let me just duplicate what you're doing so that I can get you to pay me some fraction of your monopoly profit. Think about pay for delay in pharmaceuticals. If I'm a generic, I want to go in to where there's a dominant firm, because if I can credibly threaten my generic, I will get paid a share of monopoly profit. That's not innovation in the standards of which we think of moving society forward. So suppose that we got a little more serious about preventing anti-competitive acquisitions. Would that reduce innovation? An important thing to understand is that if we're going to be more serious about competition enforcement, we're likely to be more serious both about mergers and about exclusionary conduct. So let's imagine that we got a little stricter about mergers. The innovative startup that was threatening the platform couldn't be bought by the platform. But also, we restricted the platform's ability to exclude that innovative startup with some kind of anti-competitive conduct. So then you get two opposing effects. It's harder to get bought by the platform, so then I don't want to invest. But it's much easier, if I do start up, to take share from the platform, because the anti-competitive conduct is also prevented. So that leads to more entry and more innovation. So it's not obvious to me, if you dialed up competition enforcement, that you would necessarily reduce innovation. I think you might well increase innovation. Okay, and then a second thing to say about those purchases of small nascent competitors is, we say, well, maybe it's not a problem as long as the purchase is a complement, whereas it is a competition problem if the purchase is a substitute. The issue with digital platforms is very often complements turn into substitutes later. So the platform has a partner, an app, let's say, that directly accesses and serves the platform's customers. That app might eventually be able to disintermediate, might eventually develop an installed base of its own, enough market power of its own that it doesn't need the platform so much. So the platform really is going to have an interest in positioning itself as a mandatory bottleneck between partners or applications and customers. Platforms can supply key complements themselves. They can steer customers to the complements they prefer. They can maintain control over the user relationship, and you see these strategies in practice. And these concerns have to be taken into account in merger analysis. Is the current complement a complement today, but a future threat? And do the documents of the platform indicate that they realize it's a future threat, and that's the reason for the acquisition? All right, specific antitrust tools are needed for improved enforcement. We don't really have the capabilities, in my view, at the enforcement agencies today to do a really good job of enforcing in the digital space, and that's because in the United States we have not been practicing. I think the situation is a little bit different in Europe, but we have a lot of catching up to do. I mean, the last major case brought to court in a technology space was Microsoft, arguably, although the FTC did investigate Google in 2011 and 12. But I think we need to work on a few points. One is acknowledgement of the role of behavioral biases in both the creation of market power and the effect on the quality of content. The second is tools for measuring quality in light of zero money prices. We need quality adjusted money prices, and that's a technique issue. We need more work on the critical impact of potential competitors and nascent competition on consumer welfare. When we go to court, we're not going to be able to say the potential competitor, Your Honor, would have invented products 1, 2, and 3. Okay, that's not something we are going to have the ability to do in the near future anyway, but we have to find a way to describe that. And then we need some more sophisticated market definition work, what consumers are substituting between, whether there's competition on the platform, competition between platforms. And then the analysis of the specific exclusionary conduct at issue in whatever that case is. And there's really such a large variety of anti-competitive exclusionary conduct that you can't, maybe you have less ability to list all of that in advance, and you have to wait until you have a case to work on it. And then my second point, beyond improving competition enforcement, is that a regulator, not the competition enforcer, can establish general conditions that are conducive to competition. This will help with entry and with competition in a general way, not a case-by-case way, but in a level playing field sort of way. And in the report that Tommaso mentioned, we put forward a few ideas, and some of them are here. So a regulator could routinely collect data on digital transactions and interactions, particularly with respect to large platforms. And this would allow policymakers and researchers to assess the performance of the sector. We have in the United States a airline ticket database, Databank 1A. Airline ticket prices and characteristics are filed in that database, and it's made public every quarter. We have a lot of academic work on the airline industry. Why? Because you can get prices. Okay, and before the internet, you could get prices. So this is, I think, a huge benefit and allows the regulator to harness the nonprofit sector to help do the work. Then I think we need light touch behavioral nudges where they're going to make markets more competitive, make dimensions of competition more salient, help consumers do a good job of choosing. And I think facilitating open standards in areas like micropayments and digital identity is a really underappreciated need. If there was an open standard for a micropayment, then we could get the competitive price to become negative in places where that was indeed the competitive price. And then here in Europe, you have platform-to-business regulation, which is, I think, another place that's going to be very important going forward. My last remark is going to be about remedies. I think we're a little bit focused, well, here in Europe we watch you give fines, and I have to say, fines just don't do anything. I mean, they replenish the government coffers, that's nice, you can have more public transit or something, but when there's a violation of competition law, the antitrust authority is supposed to devise a remedy, and in the United States they're supposed to restore the lost competition. Structural remedies are seen as most desirable. Why? Because you don't have to follow up with them. You do them and then you're finished, and the market takes care of itself. And there are calls everywhere for Facebook to divest Instagram and WhatsApp. But for me, the key is restoring the lost competition. The fine, as I said, doesn't do that. And Mark Zuckerberg announced in January of 2019 that he was scrambling the eggs with his acquisitions as fast as possible. What does that mean? That's a technical term in antitrust economics. When you've scrambled the eggs, you can't put the eggs back into their eggshell and make them separate again. Okay, they are irretrievably mixed. Okay. And so Facebook is now mixing. They're making their scrambled eggs vigorously. And I think by the time any case were to arrive, it would be hopeless to try to divest Instagram. Instagram won't exist anymore. You could do that, but I think there's a better option if you're going to try to restore the lost competition, which would be to say, well, if this market power was acquired illegally, the way to fix it is to have mandatory interoperability between Facebook and entrants. So if I'm an entrant, I can say to my customers, you can still keep in touch with your friends on Facebook because I will be able to link in and retrieve that information and show it to you, even though you're on my competing social media site. I think that would lead to a lot of entry because firms would be able to offer, for example, a super private social media site that cost $1 a month and was really different, and there might be a bunch of people like me that would love to be on that site as long as I could see my friends in other parts of the economy. So when restoring the lost competition, sometimes the best answer is a behavioral remedy. But this is not a good place for the antitrust authority to be. You really need a regulator, because interconnecting with Facebook is going to involve technical arguments. Facebook's going to say, I refuse to interconnect with you. You don't meet my technical standards. And then a regulator's going to have to say, here are the technical standards, and yes, the entrant meets them or doesn't, and then require compliance. So things like data sharing, full protocol interoperability, non-discrimination requirements, these are going to require ongoing oversight. Okay, so in conclusion, there are downsides to both increased antitrust enforcement and new regulation, but the costs of not doing anything are far higher than I think we thought even a few years ago. So we need to move in a way that protects consumers. Antitrust in the United States needs to be beefed up so that it works properly. I think in Europe it also needs a little bit of improvement, because these cases are very hard, and I think regulation is a really important complement, not substitute, to competition enforcement in this sector. Thank you.
So now we will move here. So we can face the audience, and so last year, I don't remember who was the chair of the session who said, I will take the first question only from a woman. Right, so that is the rule today again. So it will be first a woman, then maybe a man, then again a woman. First of all, thank you very much. So now we have essentially everything what one would like to discuss for the next few months to discuss in the next 15 minutes. So it will be a bit difficult. So one thing that I saw in all the presentation is something that actually we economists are not, or say we IO economists are not really looking a lot, is dynamics, right? There is a lot of dynamic stories. So as technology is coming, so then there is this reallocation of market share. You have maybe technology that at the beginning is very good, like in the case of the platforms, they invent new things, they are very good for consumer, but then something happened, right? And this something happens is related probably to entry. So all of you mentioned entry. You said we have the right tools. We know these are all models, boring models. Sometimes I have the feeling that it's not completely like that, right? So that in our analysis, we still really don't completely understand this mechanism, what is driving, what is good and what is bad, which is going back to your point. So what are really the causes? Also your point, what are the causes? So are we there? So what are your views? So each of you, I was very concerned at the beginning with this aggregate measures, or people talking about market shares using industries, and we said, you know what, so it's 50 years at NIO, we said you should not do that because markets are much smaller, so you have much more heterogeneity, and you say, indeed, if you look at aggregate numbers, then you miss the pictures because firms are different, and then one could say, well, but firms, it's not a firm, it's a bunch of different entities, different products, and so on. So these are this is the first issue. So do we get it right? Should we have better models? Do we understand the dynamics in the right way? So,
should I start?
Yeah.
Shouldn't it be a woman?
Oh, right. So Fiona maybe should start.
So I would like to hold two positions simultaneously. One, we definitely need, of course, better models, and there are new products being invented every minute, and we need to do work to understand them. But second, the tools that we already have and the evidence that we already have is going to take us a good part of the distance, at least in the United States, between where we are and where we ought to be. Okay, we are not using what we already know. So that is a problem that could be fixed immediately. Getting better at developing tools, for example, measuring quality-adjusted price, I think we need to do that also. So those are both true. And let me flag one more thing for you. Some of what we know because of very strong theory, and it relates to what's going to happen in the future under uncertainty. And so we need to get to a place, I think, where courts appreciate that if you're going to forecast the future and you have incentive and ability and models that show that a certain course of action is likely, and other settings where empirically that course of action has happened, that constitutes proof that we're likely to go down that same path. And we don't have to say the products that would be invented but aren't are this widget and that widget. And John has written about this. I mean, the error cost, what happens if we make a mistake? Under-enforcing, what happens if we make a mistake? Over-enforcing, how do you balance those things? And there's uncertainty. We can't know for sure in a lot of these settings.
So can we go to Jonathan exactly on this point? Because this is something that in platform markets is very, very crucial, right? So how the courts react. So what is the law? So what is your take on this point? So are we able to go there in a world that is changing so fast, where firms have the smartest people working for them and coming up with new ideas, new ways of maintaining their power or extending their power? So can we use these tools in this uncertain world?
Yes, there are a lot of directions I could answer that question in. I'll start on one or two, and you can stop me when I go on too long. One is about the role of new economic tools in addressing problems. In the 1980s, as that decade began in the United States, if you had looked at merger enforcement, people would only be thinking about coordinated effects. And then the economics profession started focusing on new empirical tools for analyzing unilateral effects among sellers of differentiated products, and that's what I actually worked on in part in my dissertation, among other things. And by the end of that decade and into the 1990s, probably the dominant approach to thinking about mergers between rivals, at any rate, involved unilateral effects, and we had scanner data, and we could estimate things, and so there's always an opportunity to bring in new economic thinking and change how antitrust is done. Now, with respect to specifically platforms, which was part of your question, there's actually, in some sense, there's nothing really, really new there at all. So there's an old case about the Rain Journal, for example, which was a large newspaper in a part of Ohio in the United States, a Supreme Court decision, and it announced it would not allow advertisers to get into its newspaper if they also advertised on the new radio station operating nearby, and
this was a brand new technology at the time. The radio.
Yes, that's where I'm going. Radio is just starting to become important. And it's going to, be very important. And if the Rain Journal what the Rain Journal did was it said, well, you can't advertise, and you have to be in the Sunday paper at the time in order to sell your products. And so that was really harming the new radio station. And had it succeeded in being permitted to exclude the radio station that way, you wouldn't have had the development of radio except for radio stations that were owned by the newspaper. It would have, so this is an example of how antitrust enforcement, this was, facilitated the development of a new technology by preventing exclusionary conduct, and it's ages old. It's in the 50s, I think, and in a Supreme Court decision. So now you're right that there are new ways of excluding. You're sort of suggesting that it's hard we have new kinds of platforms and things, and there are bad decisions. A recent decision by the U.S. Supreme Court involving American Express creates barriers of sorts to attacking exclusionary conduct by platforms. But on the whole, the antitrust, the development of new economic tools and pre-existing precedents and the history of antitrust suggests to me that yes, it's antitrust is potentially available and could, if courts understand the economics of the situation appropriately and could be effective.
So what is your view on this issue of dynamics entry? And so it doesn't seem to be the thing that drives your result, but so you have these superstar firms. Has that something to do with the exploitation of a dominant position and then excluding entry? Could that be one story?
I mean, I think we obviously would like to have better models and better ways to understand what's going on. But I agree with Fiona that I don't think that's the most pressing issue. If we get better models, maybe computing power will help us solve that. That will help. But I don't think that's the fundamental issue. I mean, it's been going on for 4 decades, and nothing's been done. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a much more pressing issue, which is, what can we do and how can we do it? Because my understanding is, and I come from a completely different side and more from the macro side, is that, the institutions are there, the legislation is there. I mean, I understand the Sherman Act is really fairly accurate and the right tool, but still it doesn't help us enforce or create competitive markets. And I think there's something else institutionally that is at stake, I believe, and that needs rethinking. Now, one thing I would like to add, and this I believe has been absent from the debate in I/O, is that once you recognize that it's not just one particular market where we have concerns about competitiveness, but it's a widespread, economy-wide issue, then I ask myself, shouldn't we include in the objectives of an institution that say, a general federal competitive agency that's going to include things like, should we worry about the effect on wages? Should we affect, all the stakeholders in society? I mean, the Federal Reserve Bank, is in control of monetary policy, but one of its mandates is employment. Has nothing to do with inflation, but it's a mandate that people consider is related to inflation, is important. And we believe, I think as economists, as academic economists, that the biggest success, I think a lot of people say, of academia is that, we've created an independent central bank, because we believe that, the independent central bank controls inflation, takes the policy of inflation control out of the hands and the temptations of policymakers, because we understand that they have the temptation to, in electoral interest, to change the policies that are not in the interest of society. Now, measures of inflation control for welfare are below 1% of GDP. That is, the welfare cost of business cycles and out-of-hand inflation is 1% of GDP. If we believe that profit rates are 15%, of value added, I mean, this is a much bigger cost to society. And the question is, what is it that we, with the current tools, can do? Should we not include this broad-based impact of, the decline in competitiveness as an objective in an institution, which I believe, should be something similar to an independent central bank, an independent competition authority, because, politicians are pressured through lobbying, even through the judicial system in appointing judges and things like that, to affect the enforcement of these laws. My understanding, again, is that the laws are right, the laws do a lot, but the enforcement of it is not going right. And then it's not just antitrust, it's regulation, it's patent law. There's a broad set of issues that I think, in my view, should be reconsidered, and we should think about putting this in one agency. And I don't want to create, another big agency or something like that, but we should really think of something that's going to be fundamentally enforcing competitive markets. And I think that's been absent from the debate. And I think it's at least something worth considering.
This is a really good point. Just towards the end of the Obama administration, there was an executive order essentially not creating a new agency, but saying that every agency and every regulation should be taking into account competition and the impact on competition of their regulations. And this, I think, goes to, in the United States, the ability of corporations to spend money in various ways, and the way we've interpreted free speech to involve money in politics, so that we can enable the parties that earn the monopoly profit to write the rules. And I think it's just, I appreciate that this is playing into the hands of the label that I'm trying to shed. But it is still the case that I think we have just tons of objective information about the extent to which lobbying alters the way the FDA lets in biosimilars, that the Department of Transportation requires or doesn't require airlines to share information with aggregators that do price comparisons, with the courts that tend to rule for the employer in something like mandatory arbitration. There's just endless examples across every part of the regulatory apparatus that is ruling in ways that shift the surplus from the consumer to the corporation, and that then causes political problems down the road. And antitrust is one piece of that, but I completely agree it's not.
But so can I then ask, because this is a very, very hot issue in the debate in antitrust, are we doing it wrong? So you say all other policies should consider competition, but should competition policy, antitrust, consider also these other objectives? When we deal with mergers, should we be concerned with...
So it's not other objectives, be careful. There's a school of thought that would like to put into merger policy other things like literacy, local, I'm making up literacy, that's not really true, but local ownership, is there a political, are we increasing the political power of this corporation with the merger, stuff like that. Okay, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the fact that if an airline in the United States refuses to share its flight schedule with an aggregator that's going to do price comparisons, the Department of Justice has no ability to manage that. That's not in their purview. It would be the Department of Transportation. So you would have to have a president or a head of the Department of Transportation that thought its job was protecting consumers and consumer welfare rather than protecting airline profits. It's not obvious to me that that's what we have in the United States. Changing that requires, I think it's a political expression. I mean, you would have to, I think, elect, in any jurisdiction, elect people running the government who thought that their job was to protect consumers.
So what is your point on this issue? Because, this is really a big issue. So, we will see this afternoon also, so all issues related to the political power of these corporations, right, are very important. And now some people, as you were mentioning, so this, how is it called? The trendy, no, not hipster antitrust, so thinking that one should expand the set of criteria that antitrust authorities should consider when making their decision. So it's a fine line, right? Because Jan was mentioning so labor. So right.
Sorry, that's not a political thing. Labor. If you're going to have market power and push down wages as a monopsonist, that's covered under existing antitrust law.
Okay.
So
Fiona,
price, quality, innovation, it's all in there.
But Fiona, I was referring even to equilibrium effects, right? If we see market power go up economy-wide, even if you have zero monopsony, wages would fall. And this is a point. I'm not saying it should be like, but it should be on the table as a part of the debate.
So, Jonathan.
So yes. So let me first agree with Fiona about a couple of things. That greater competition generally has a lot of ancillary beneficial effects on other kinds of things we care about, just like inequality, for example. The danger in that we have to worry about. It's important to insulate, though, to insulate antitrust enforcement from direct political influence. There's dangers about partisan misuse. There's dangers of firms exploiting the using political influence to create entry barriers and benefit themselves, and then there's systemic possibilities of crony capitalism and the like, all of which can be at least impeded, at any rate, by the norm we have in the United States that individual antitrust enforcement decisions and case decisions are look solely to competition, to the economics of competition. So on the one hand, it's important to have strong competition for a host of reasons, including discouraging things like the development of crony capitalism or oligarchy kind of concerns. But on the other hand, I don't think we want to take those concerns directly into account in antitrust enforcement. And so in the United States, for example, we have I'd rather see campaign finance reform and other kinds of policies directed at the concerns about the exercise of political power by large corporations than to be thinking about them directly when enforcing the antitrust laws.
Okay, so I have plenty of other questions, but I think I should stop and give you the chance to ask something. So, who wants? Joanna. State your name and so. Wait.
Thank you. Joanna Piechocka from DIW. I have a question to Fiona. First of all, thank you for your great presentation. Each time I had a question, you answered it in the next slide. Maybe more of a practical question. You underlined a list of changes which may be introduced to competition policy and regulation. My question is whether, from your experience in practice, enforcement agencies, regulators, do they have the manpower, the technical expertise, and the willingness to, let's say, address these challenges, especially in line of these digital markets moving so fast? So are you optimistic, or as consumers, are we doomed?
We are not doomed. The manpower question is quite easy. The enforcement agencies are seriously understaffed. If you look as a percentage, if you took manpower as to GDP ratios, I think you would have to increase the budgets by a factor of 4, something like that, to get back to where we were in 1970, for example. So it's quite a big problem. On the technical side, as I gave that list of things that we need to work on. This is not an insurmountable list. It's a list we need to start, but I think if people, there's many graduate students like you everywhere around the world, there's lots of good problems, we just start working on them. I think it's not insurmountable. The third is perhaps the hardest. You need both an executive that wants to do this, a head of an enforcement agency that wants to do this, and a court that is going to listen. And all those 3 things together, I think, are a challenge. I think the staff at the enforcement agency is not the problem. I think they're interested in protecting consumers. That's why they're there. So it's a question of whether there is some political will. In the United States, I think in particular, you have to be willing to lose. And I feel that there's a lot of celebration of agencies that have a good win record. When I was in the Justice Department under Obama, our merger litigation record was 100%. Now, that's very good on the one hand, but you think about it a little longer and you think maybe we were not bringing cases that were so difficult if we were winning 100%. So if there is a harm, I think it's really important for an agency to articulate that harm, bring it to a court, make it public. The court has the option to say, no, I don't believe you, but then all of society, the reporters, the legislators, consumers themselves have seen the harm, and if the court chooses not to enforce it, then society, a democratic society, can form some other solution. Okay, perhaps we will take this kind of problem away from courts and give it to someone else to decide, or we will create a regulatory agency if the courts can't do it right, or something. But if you do not bring the case because you are afraid that you will lose, you will never find out what is going to happen, and society doesn't have that chance to make an alternative plan for what to do.
May I add something?
Yeah, sure.
I want to add one thing to what Fiona said, which is that antitrust enforcement works in for the most part through deterrence, rather than through identifying the problems and curing it. All that's important, but the main way in which we get a competitive economy is by having rules that firms are counseled to live within. And one of the important tasks is to change the rules, encourage, in the U.S. setting, have the courts change where the standards are, and then you'll see firms policing themselves much more than they do now, which I think ties into Fiona's you should be willing to risk losses, which is what happens when you want to try and push the rules and encourage the courts to think differently.
Wait just a second for the mic.
Paul Nemitz from the European Commission. I have a question to Fiona. You said the payment with data theoretically has a price, obviously. But I'm just wondering, traditionally one says there's information in equilibrium between the buyer and the seller. The seller knows the product better and therefore is more informed on the price. And now we have a currency on which the buyer also actually doesn't know the value. I mean, if you pay in dollars or euros, at least you know what you're paying. So we have an increased intransparency in the transaction on both sides, because the seller will also know better the value of the currency with which the uninformed buyer is paying. Is that a reason for an economist to exclude this type of transaction, or what would you do about this if you say that payment with data, in theory there is a price and could be an option?
I think this is one place where regulation and competition enforcement are complements. If we have better regulations setting rules for what digital businesses can and cannot do by way of privacy, and more transparency that the consumer gets to pick whether they're in bucket A, bucket B, or bucket C with respect to what they're sharing and what they're not sharing, then there is a more transparent product that you're buying, and it's easier to decide how much it's worth. Okay, so you can think about an analogy in the physical world. If I don't quite know what I'm purchasing, it's really difficult. How does a wine set its price? Most people are buying a bottle of wine looking at the label, and that's really difficult. Once you get to if you could standardize wine quality to be a numerical score, 81, 82, 96, 97, then maybe price competition becomes more important. So this is a little bit the same thing here. People don't know what privacy they are losing. They do not appreciate that their data is being sold to 17 other people all around the web. And that means that then they don't appreciate that if that site is going to offer them a price of 0, and there is another site with a price of -3, and that other site has better privacy conditions, then you would think to yourself, well, I'm being paid, and my privacy is better, I'm going to move to this other site. So the consumer needs to be fully informed for the market to work.
So actually it would be the turn of a woman, but... It's okay. Yeah, right, so it's okay.
So,
yeah.
if I may,
yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to pose a question to Fiona and Jonathan. You may have heard of the decision of the Federal Cartel Authority of Germany as regards Facebook that has recently been taken. And I wonder what your comment on that would be. First question. Second question, is that what they try to do to mix competition regulation with data protection? Is that a cure to the scrambled egg methodology you just pointed out, Fiona. That will be of interest for me. Thank you.
So I don't know it very well, that decision. My understanding is that, but I could be wrong about this, so you'll have to correct me, that what the decision holds is that the Facebook abused its dominance by failing to live up to its privacy obligations in Germany, something like that. That's not a theory that works comfortably in the United States. So I haven't thought closely about it. In the United States, if we had, if you could show that there was privacy competition, that is to say, Facebook and other social media platforms or something like, let's say, were competing to offer better privacy protections, and then somehow Facebook does something to exclude those others, then that's how we would fit in the loss of the privacy as an anti-competitive effect, that the exclusionary conduct stopped this form of non-price competition. But I don't think that's a way of understanding what Germany did. And I think of that decision more as a consumer protection decision in US terms than as an antitrust one, and so don't really have a lot more to say.
I think it's useful to think about an analogy between symptom and cause. So we have a symptom which is a loss of quality, let's call that privacy, but the cause is market power. So a decision that says you can't do this on privacy might help consumers, as Jonathan said, consumer protection. It doesn't go to the cause. How does it change the market power of Facebook? I think it doesn't. This is what I mean about fines, and remedies need to fix the underlying cause. And in the United States, we don't have an excessive pricing rule. So when you have the market power, you're allowed to charge a high price or have a low quality or not innovate. And the issue is, did you get that market power on the merits or by doing some anti-competitive act? And if you got it on the merits because you had a good product, then eventually someone will replace you because now you're charging a high price and giving low quality. But if you got it through some violation, then we go after the violation.
So shouldn't, and then I give you the word, but so then shouldn't we just be tougher on mergers, right? So just avoid of giving corporation excessive power through mergers. So because we know that once Facebook and Instagram are together, might be not so problematic, but there is a high chance that that will become problematic, right? So would that not be a solution? Just be more inventive on how to prevent this kind of concentration.
So I will say 2 sentences and then pass it to Jonathan. I mean, I think Massimo Motta has said this lots of times. We should just shift the burden of proof, because why should the government be in the position of needing to come up with a reason to block a merger? If you want to merge, it should maybe be your responsibility to explain to the people why your merger is helping. If you can explain why it's helping because it makes a new product or it lowers prices, then terrific, you should merge. If you can't explain why it's helping, then don't merge. Yeah. And if you shifted the burden, that would make a big difference. But I think that the risk piece goes back to this error cost issue. You know, if there's a big risk in the future, then you have to make that part of the analysis.
So yes, we should be tougher on mergers in general, and for the reason that Fiona just said, that we're under-deterring anti-competitive conduct relative to our concern about not chilling beneficial conduct. And yes, being tougher on mergers would help with innovation and privacy and that sort of thing. And but the details of how to be tougher depend on the jurisdiction and how the rules work in different places.
So we have a question there, and thank you for waiting.
Hi, I'm Lucia Soberg. I'm a student at Humboldt University. And I would like to ask all of you what your thoughts are on supranational regulation. So we talked a lot about like the US market, but I was, for example, thinking about Donald Trump issuing this ban basically on Huawei, which now can't use Google's Android system anymore. And there I would like to know what your suggestions are for better supranational institutions that can effectively go against these things that feel more like protecting the US economy than actually protecting consumers worldwide.
I think that's a macro question.
So, I mean, you know, I think it's ideally you would have a world agency, right? I mean, between Luxembourg and France, it's two different countries, and between Vermont and New Hampshire, it's the same country. I mean, that's just incidences or coincidences of history, what is global and what is national and what is international trade. I mean, of course, reality is different. And I think, as with intellectual property, there are international treaties. You know, this has to happen gradually and organically. You cannot just start with a UN agency on enforcement. But yes, and I think what we see also, you know, in the data, that the type of firms that are the superstar firms are the ones that are active globally. Right. And part of the reason why they become superstar firms is because they have such a wide reach, no? And all the examples that Fiona gave in terms of, you know, why is it these firms can scale? I mean, Uber, I think within a week can set up an operation in a different country just because everything scales. And then clearly it is an issue of international cooperation. But again, you know, if you can't even do it at national levels, you know, I guess that's where we should start.
So, but can I ask, because you passed by, but is it true, do you observe in the data, especially in the second paper where you have the global data set, do you really observe that a potential source of market power is with the fact that you are multinational operating in many, many markets? Can you measure this effect, or is something that is more so descriptive?
I mean, I have indirect evidence. The direct evidence that I have is on the data set that we have, only a very small subsample of the firms basically decompose by legal requirements, decomposing their reporting on what is national and what is international sales. When we decompose those on that small subsample, we don't see much of a difference, but that is already of such a selected sample. Mm-hmm. These are already the international firms. Right. And so we don't see much of an issue. My indirect evidence for why it is the case is if you look at manufacturing within the publicly traded firms and the census of manufacturing, which is the universe of firms within the US, and we see that the magnitude of the increase is smaller within that within the universe, so it must be that there's something about the selection of the publicly traded firms that makes it larger. And the selection of publicly traded firms is typically internationally active firms. And that's my indirect evidence. But, you know, ideally I would like to have a data set where I can say, take the census of manufacturing and know the ones that are exporting and importing and then do that exercise. I think surely somehow we'll find a way to do that. But I think it's a key question in my view to understand what's going on.
I think not today there's actually a lot of global enforcement by Europe that is protecting US consumers. And this is, I think, wonderful for us. We're free riding, as usual.
We have free rided for a long time before.
Yeah, so. Free ridden, yeah. But it is actually a real question because market structures and competitive conditions are not necessarily the same in each country. So if there was some conduct that a global firm was engaging in and it had impacts in Europe and the United States, suppose that the impact was really quite bad in Europe but wasn't bad in the United States, or the other way around. One jurisdiction would have a strong reason to block that conduct, and they would be right. You would go to court, and it would be right. And in the other, it would not be right, and you would go to court, and it would not be right. So you could legitimately have two different answers, and those democracies would legitimately want to protect themselves, either efficiency, allowing for efficiencies, or blocking harms. So then these global companies are going to have to work out, Can I have a search engine or a business product that is tailored for one jurisdiction or another, or is there a way for me to do a remedy that satisfies one jurisdiction and doesn't harm my business in another? I think this is going to be a very serious problem in future years, and I don't think you could have a global agency, but then it is trading off the harm in one jurisdiction to the harm in another, and that's really not a job I would want.
Well, right. So maybe on that point. So I think that is one example, but the problem is much more general. So very often when we enforce competition policy, we have redistributional effects. Right, so because some customer can profit, some cannot profit. So what the European Commission, for instance, does is thinking about the mean European consumers, right? So now, so is it something we should think more carefully, especially in digital markets, where so the heterogeneity of consumers may play an even major role because with all this data at hand, product can be much more tailored and so on. So the conduct of firms can strongly affect some customer more than others. Customers which have higher biases might be right. So how do we go with this?
Yeah, in the US we don't have this rule. It's actually officially, if the conduct harms a subgroup, it can be blocked. There is no mechanism to redistribute the benefit from the others to that harm, so you can't do it. So we don't take the mean consumer. But I think with digital markets, it's all so personalized. The firms know everything about me and my price and my behavior. I don't see why anybody needs to be harmed. I mean, if there was a ability of a regulator or an enforcement agency to put in a remedy, you could explicitly say, I want you to behave in a certain way to these people with these characteristics, and that would be possible. In a way, it's not possible if you are a steel company to know who is buying that steel bar one day, but we know exactly who is seeing the ad. So it seems to me there is much more scope to fix anything that regulators want to fix.
Well, two comments on this conversation. One is that 40 years ago, the problem was gaps that one jurisdiction would only see able to deal with some of the problem, and other parts of the problem, and they weren't really. Only the U.S. was trying to enforce extraterritorially, and now the problem is overlaps, where all the countries have extensive antitrust institutions and are interested in the same conduct, and there's actually a coordination issue that the national authorities work on, and courts also through principles of comity too, and it's not elegant, but short of a supranational authority that would cede sovereignty to some global competition regulator, it's what we're going to have to deal with. And I'm not sure the latter is anything that is a serious possibility, in the world. And my other observation is, so that was on the legal side. On the economic side, is just to reinforce what Fiona said, that in the United States, at any rate, we don't allow cross-market trades, essentially, in thinking about reviewing, conduct. That is to say, we think in a partial equilibrium context in figuring out the welfare consequences of harmful conduct, and we don't say whether it's probably consumer surplus or counterparty surplus, when it's a monopsony-ish type case, but consumer surplus rather than aggregate surplus. But either way, we don't allow someone to say, well, there's this benefit in surplus in some other market that we ought to trade off against the harms in this market. That's a policy question, and there are reasons to do it the way we do. It have to do with things like administrability and assuring political support for the antitrust laws, as much as anything else. But it's also and the only real deviation from that is in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion, particularly in mergers by the enforcement agencies, where the U.S. enforcement agencies will say, well, maybe if there's a big efficiency in, if there's a harm in one market, then it's small, and a big efficiency in another market that's and you can't get the efficiency benefits without the harm, we'll let the merger go and not challenge it. But that's a prosecutorial decision, not a legal rule that a court would apply.
Thomas, can I just add one?
Yes.
Coming back to the question on the global reach, I think one thing it should not be is which has happened in the antitrust enforcement or the competition enforcement in the EU is to go after profits. You know, this idea that the authorities have to go after the profits that, say, Apple hides through Holland and Dublin and then puts them in the Virgin Islands. I mean, of course, we all want the money to be taxed appropriately, but I think for an antitrust authority, the best way to tax profits is to make sure that they're not there. And if they manage to have competitive markets, there won't be a reason to hide the profits in the Virgin Islands. And I think it's not the objective of the antitrust authority to do that. And that's a global issue, which I think someone else should do that.
No. If the profits weren't there,
I completely agree, but what I'm saying is, it was particularly Massimo Motta talking about him earlier. I mean, one of the things that they did during his time at the antitrust authorities was going after those profits, and I agree they shouldn't be doing that.
But the European Commission is not only an antitrust authority, it's also an anti-state aid and subsidy authority, which is a completely different instrument in law and also follows very different economic models.
But the point is that suppose
it's about
that there
payment
were more...
of taxes. It's about that they pay their taxes, and it's about avoiding in Europe, according to our primary law, which is the treaty, special deals, special state aid subsidies, which are passed from the state to companies, either in cash or in the form of saying to them, everybody has to pay taxes except you.
Yeah.
So what Jan is saying is, imagine that there were more competitive markets and those profits didn't exist at all. If those profits didn't exist, then no one could say everyone else pays profits except you, because you wouldn't be paying profits because you don't have any profits. Sorry, everyone pays taxes except you. You wouldn't be paying taxes on your profits because your profits would be zero. So the problem of this form that needs to be solved later becomes much smaller if there aren't so many profits to begin with. That sounds bad. We don't, profits seem like a sign of a thriving industry. Well, it's more thriving if those profits are transformed into lower prices and better quality. Then they are spread across all consumers rather than belonging to the shareholders of those companies. So it's really just like getting rid of the problem to begin with.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I mean, now we have to go a little bit deeper here. The reason why these companies are making profits in part is because they're not paying their taxes. The average tax on the digital companies in Europe is less than 1%. And that's why, this is a tax policy issue and there's a state aid issue. And by the way, this is primary law of the European Union that we go after state aids. Maybe in America you don't know this instrument. In America it's a little bit more Darwinistic in terms of government support. You don't have a good discipline between the different states. But here it's primary law. And to say you should do that, you should work with other instruments, I think it misses the point, because they make part of their profits by not paying taxes.
Nobody said that you shouldn't do that, just to be clear.
Right.
I mean, I agree we should go after the profits. That's not the point. If you have 40 people working on antitrust in Brussels, I think it's not a good idea that 20 of them go after enforcement of tax payments. I'm sure there's other tax authorities that do that job. I don't think it's the antitrust authority that should do that. That's the point I was trying to make.
Okay, so 12:02. It was a very broad and instructive discussion. I'm sure that many of the topics that we started discussing now will be further discussed in the last session. So let me thank again the panelists for this very interesting discussion, and see you then after lunch.